Hello everybody, welcome to More Chainsaws Needed, where, because I love horror, thrillers and suspense, I am going to talk, rant, rave about, review and recommend movies, TV series and books in those genres for you as I draw. We are going to continue the trip through the original 5-man band that were the original Universal monsters, and this time we are going to talk about the most changed and most often forgotten, as his story has evolved into a completely different genre that has nothing to do with horror, even as if it keeps the main plot of the original movie intact. I am talking about the dark, brooding boy of our band, the eternal romantic that will belt ballads about her beloved, the Mummy. The Mummy is also very special in the Universal monster canon, as it's the very first one that is a completely original monster, not based in any book or legend prior. Yes, it has a lot of inspiration from ancient Egypt mythology, but taking so many liberties with it that it might as well be a completely new beast. So let's talk about the original Mummy, or dear man Imhotep, and his eternal quest for his beloved. Another very well-known monster, the Mummy, you would think that this one has had less changes than their predecessors, because how much you can change a mummy? It's a dead Egyptian covered with bandages that comes back to life, right? Well, wrong. The Mummy has probably had as many changes as Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, starting with the fact that it's not the same mummy in every movie. Not to mention, he's the one who has changed genres, outside comedy and parodies, more than everyone else in the classic Universal monster roster. In fact, we have two named mummies in the classical Universal monster movies, Imhotep and Charis. We will only discuss Imhotep because he was the first, and Charis is a little bit more complicated, although he is the one who has the most classic horror mummy tropes, including being controlled by someone else, while Imhotep is complicated. We could say that Imhotep is the original nice guy, trademarked, and I will explain why. But before that, let's go on a bit of the interesting facts of the origins of the Mummy as an Universal monster. As I said, our good old Imhotep is special because he's the first completely original classic Universal monster. Yes, unlike Dracula and the Frankenstein monsters, when we come to Imhotep, while he has certain influences from various sources, from ancient Egypt to the short Arthur Conan Doyle story, The Book of Thoth, his whole story, powers, and all the extra characters around it are a complete creation by story writers Nina Wilcox Pontham and Richard Sire. To be more precise, the only thing that the Mummy has in common with Egyptian mummies is that, well, Imhotep was from Egypt and at some point was fully bandaged like a traditional mummy. Other than that, the whole mummies come back to life is a modern fabrication, as well as the mummies can be controlled by priests using ancient potions and spells, which only appears in the sequel and reimaginings, starting from The Mummy's Hand, which is where Charis is portrayed in this by Tom Tyler and in the sequel by Lon Chaney Jr. comes from. Ancient Egypt didn't also have any beliefs in reincarnation as far as I could find, so that one is also a modern addition to the whole legend. There is also the important fact that Imhotep is the first Universal monster with a clear purpose in his own life. While Dracula only wanted to find more food for himself and his wives, and the Frankenstein creature only wanted friends and companionship, Imhotep actually wants to bring his beloved Ankh-Senamun back to life. He's so determined about that he got buried alive in ancient Egypt for trying to do so, and when by mere chance he got resurrected in the present time, well, 1921, the present time for the era of the movie, he launched a 10-year plan to do exactly that, without bothering anyone until they started to get on his way. The man is patient, that is what I want you guys to know. And here is also where I warn modern audiences. While The Mummy is a gorgeous movie that should be watched by any horror fan who wants to understand the history and evolution of horror movies, for modern fare is very slow and very lacking on the horror part. There is no gore, no violent deaths, well, maybe one, the dog, but the dog dies off camera. No jump scares, even if there is a cat. It is closer to a suspense movie than a horror movie, and the plot is pure romance, which, in a weird spin that I don't think has ever been repeated, is better built between the villain and the heroine than between the hero of the piece and the heroine. And yes, you heard the scare quotes around hero. I am going to talk about Frank Wemple and his status as a hero a bit later. The Mummy Hands from 1940 has a little bit more of horror, but it's still pretty much based on the idea of love surviving death, and it relies a little bit more on the adventure side of the archaeologist trope, which is also present in Mummy's Tomb from 1942, where Lon Chaney made his debut as the mummy. This is probably why, of all the original classic Universal monsters, the Mummy's revival in 1999 was the only one that never tried to be a horror movie. Instead, it became a full Indiana Jones style adventure with a far more proactive Imhotep, which became a beloved classic even now, and later on the attempt to make it back into a horror adventure movie in 2017 was a complete and total flop, and I am not going to talk about that one. Because despite the dead coming back to life and some people dying at their hands, the Mummy is, at its core, a romance. And romances tend to go better with adventure than with horror, after all. So let's talk about Imhotep first, because he's the original mummy and the main character of his movie. Now, given how mummies are depicted nowadays, a mixture between a Frankenstein's creature who fell on a toilet paper factory and a zombie, it's interesting to note that the actor was also Boris Karloff, the first and best known Frankenstein, and his makeup and looks were created by none other than Jack Pierce, who also made the Frankenstein creature makeup. Of course, the makeup was so complicated at first that took so long that we only see him in that particular getup in one scene, the revival one. The rest of the movie has Karloff with much less makeup, no bandages to be seen, and basically just a very bad case of dry skin. Which is why probably most people remember the first scene, or at least the look of the first scene, because after that, seriously, our pal Imhotep looks just like a normal man with a bad hydration routine and a very, very, very piercing gaze. The story of Imhotep is actually quite tragic. First, the man was a priest in ancient Egypt who happened to fall in love with the worst person possible, Pharaoh's daughter and virgin priest of Isis, Ankhesenamun. Then she got sick with an incurable illness which may or may not have been a punishment from the gods for their forbidden love, and dies. But hey, Imhotep has access to the Scroll of Thoth, which has a ritual that can bring the dead back to life. So he goes inside the tomb and starts reading it in order to bring her back to him, but he gets caught by the pharaoh, who, as punishment, orders him to be mummified alive. Well, half mummified because obviously they didn't take out all his organs as they want him to suffer. Oh, and they also take out all the hieroglyphics about reaching Anubis and the land of the dead, just to make sure that his soul is forever trapped in limbo. For the simple crime of loving the wrong person, and so far, well, we can't but feel bad for poor Imhotep, right? Thing is, for some reason the ancient Egyptians also decided to bury him with the Skull of Thoth, because, well, why not? I mean, no one is going to find it there, right? Because they killed every single person who knew where they buried Imhotep. Well, unfortunately, ancient Egyptians did not predict that a couple of hundred years later, British men would be digging everywhere in the desert in order to find whatever they could find. Nor that some of them would be stupid enough to open the box clearly labeled, "Cursed box, do not open," inside of which there was another box also labeled, "No, seriously, cursed box, we mean it, keep it closed or die." So, in 1921, an archaeological team finds Imhotep mummy and the Scroll of Thoth, and the youngest members of it, once he's conveniently alone, reads the scroll out loud because, of course, and brings Imhotep back to life. Seeing the mummy walk away with the scroll is so terrifying for this poor fella that he goes insane and, as we are told later, dies laughing in a straitjacket. Archaeologists need a little bit more of, experience before starting to wake up the dead. 10 years later, Imhotep is living under the name Ardet Bey and helps another archaeological team, conveniently led by the son of the archaeologist who led the previous one, to find Ankhesenamun's tomb, as this is all part of his plans to bring her back to life. Except she's already reincarnated in the form of Helen Grosvenor, the daughter of an Egyptian diplomat who just so happens to be in town the day that the treasures found in Ankhesenamun's tomb are presented to the public in the Cairo Museum, because here, apparently, the British Museum did not want the Egyptian treasures. If you are asking where the horror is in all this, Oh well, the scene of where Imhotep is buried alive is quite terrifying, even for modern audiences, but it's put quite later in the film. As I pointed out, this is more of a suspense movie, building tension little by little instead of throwing scares to us left and right. Imhotep himself only becomes a real threat once he realizes that Ankhesenamun has been reincarnated and decides not only to kidnap Helen by hypnotizing her and forcing her to come to him under the threat of death if she disobeys, but also to kill and mummify her in order to bring her back to life, despite this being against the wishes of both Helen and Ankhesenamun once her memories of the past are returned. It also has a quite low death count, which only two victims of the mummy himself, the one who dies laughing and then Frank's father. Ironically, the reason why Imhotep didn't just, brought the Ankhesenamun mummy back to life was because, in his words, if he did, the result would be a woman without a soul who would obey him unconditionally, being just a reflection of the memories of his lover. And then he completely disregards his actual lover wishes by saying, I want you to obey me unconditionally. But it's nice to know that he understands consent well enough to ignore it, right? The most interesting thing about the mummy is that the horror is implied. There are a few scenes that are explicit. I already mentioned Imhotep being mummified alive, but there is also how he kills Wempo Sr. with a heart attack at a distance with only his mind power. But everything else comes from the implications in the story. What happens to a soul trapped in limbo for so many years? Was he evil from the beginning, or was he turned evil by the desperation and loneliness of centuries? How did he manage to become Ardat Bey in the 10 years between being waking up and him finding a way to lead the British diggers to Ankhesenamun's tomb? How much free will Helen had, as we know that she yearned for the pure ancient Egypt even before Imhotep tried to wake up Ankhesenamun's soul? And are all the Egyptian gods and mummies still present in the statues that were worshipped, just waiting for the right person to read the wrong incarnation? Because everyone got lucky here that the mummy that got awakened was just a nice guy who didn't understand the word no. But what if they had waken up one who really wanted to conquer the world? Not only that, but heroes here are quite different from what we expect from horror heroes. Yes, Jonathan Harker had his useless moments in Dracula, but at the end he rose to the situation and became the hero, sometimes with the help of the others, sometimes alone, depending on the adaptation. Victor Frankenstein was the creator of his own problems, but in every version of the story, he always tries to fix it himself, with various degrees of success depending on the writer. But here, well, Frank Whipple is there to fall in love with Helen even before she speaks a word to him, and follow instructions from the friend of his father who actually knows what is going on. This man is so well versed in ancient Egyptian magic and curses that he becomes the movie's Seinfeld, as he explains everything that is not shown directly on the screen, and who sometimes has very weird leaps of intuition as he decides that something happened just because he thinks as that way, and he's usually right. This doctor, besides being an amazing infodumper, doesn't do much either, as he fails to protect Wemple Sr., can't stop Helen from falling into Imhotep's trance, and pretty much decides to give up in the middle of the big battle because he admits that Imhotep is more powerful than him. Our heroes, everyone! And yet, neither man is the one who stops Imhotep too. That honor goes, in a very, very rare case for the 30s, to Ankhesenamun herself. Because once Imhotep wakes her fully in Helen's body, at first she's elated to see him. She wonders if the god finally forgiven them for their love and is ready to spend her life with him. Important part here, her life. Unfortunately, Imhotep has other plans for her. He wants her to join him in mummykind, and for that he needs to kill her, mummify her, and bring her back to life. And Ankhesenamun is not so much into that idea. In fact, she fights like a hellcat. Well, a 30s hellcat, which means mostly screaming that she doesn't want this and asks every single man in her path to stop Imhotep. And then she remembers. She is a virgin priest of Isis. And there's a very convenient Isis statue right there. A little bit of prayer, and Isis takes care of the Scroll of Thoth, which in turn takes care of Imhotep right away. and everyone is happy as Akasena Moon returns to her past and Helen regains control of her body. Yay! And yes, this is the exact same romantic plot that Francis Ford Coppola forced onto poor Dracula, just in case you thought I was not going to mention that. But you can see how this works a lot better as an action-adventure story, right? I mean, in the third version, we weren't shown any interesting scene in any tomb or excavation. To be precise, it is quite realistic on one hand, as Dr. Wemple Sr. insists that one gets more knowledge from broken pot pieces than from big discoveries, and then becomes absolutely ridiculous as he also claims that the British archaeologists are in Egypt for the science and not for the loot. Of course. But we don't see any Indiana Jones heroic types here. That is for the 99 remakes, which follows the same steps of the plot, mostly as it changes Frank Wemple for Brendan Fraser, who is more like a bandit adventurer who actually knows what he's doing, or is much better at pretending that he does. Ardeth Ray is now someone bent on keeping Imhotep asleep and not Imhotep himself, and now for some reason Imhotep is afraid of cats, when he used to have one at his service that killed a dog. But it makes the Mummy into a fun adventure story rather than a horror one, and it's still very good, so also watch that one. This is not to say that you can't tell a horror story with the Mummy. Universal themselves did much better with the follow-ups, and later Hammer films will keep the tradition until other, more numerous and less romantic Living Dead managed to conquer the world's imagination. But we need a good writer who gets why the Mummy's story can be terrifying, rather than one who believes that it's horror just because it happens to involve a living corpse and ancient Egypt. The Mummy is one of the weird Universal classic monsters that found far better success in a different genre than when he started, and was not that successful as a horror movie solo villain, but yet is still considered a horror monster classic. While not by actual name, as Imhotep and Latarkaris are rarely named outside their movies, if you have a reunion of monsters for a parody, the Mummy will be among them. As I said, the original movie is very much a product of its time, but if you have the chance, I'd give it a watch. It's very interesting and it's a very great look at how horror and suspense worked back in the 30s, even if it aged a little bit more poorly than the original Dracula and Frankenstein, and, let's be honest, Boris Karloff is always a treat for a horror fan. I want to thank my DI patrons, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica and Ali Riley, as well as my first supporter Tere Pineda and the most amazing Amy Sung, without whom none of my videos would be possible. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Alisa, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else, and get the chance to suggest future subjects for this. You can also support me through Ko-fi, and for each coffee, you will get mentioned in 3 future videos. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. This was Alisa Zarate, and remember, there is not a problem in the horror genre that cannot be solved with chainsaws and a cup of good coffee.